Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out on such a cold night. It's really lovely to see so many folks here. We're just going to get started. Welcome to the Island Lecture Series. For those of you who haven't been to an Island Lecture, this series has been running on and off since the 1980s. Just a show of hands, who has been here to an Island Lecture Series before? Okay, and who has never been to an Island Lecture Series before? Awesome, nice, fantastic. As I mentioned to some of you, feel free to move your chairs around. If you want to move an armchair into a prime location, you're welcome to do that. Make yourself comfortable. The washrooms are just down the hall on the left. There's two gender-neutral washrooms. You can use either one. So feel free to get up and move around if you need to at any time. As we gather here today in the faculty lounge, I want to respectfully acknowledge the history, spirituality, culture, and rights of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast to coast, who have called this land home since time immemorial. And this acknowledgement, of course, is nothing without action, or as the late John Joe Sark used to call it, reconciliation. So I encourage us to consider, each of us, how we can, in our own way, honor and uphold our obligations as treaty people. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bren Simmers. I'm the managing editor of Island Studies Press, and Island Studies Press is part of the Institute of Island Studies, and we've been publishing books about the island since the mid-80s. We're located just down that hall. On your way to the washrooms, you'll see a whole bunch of our beautiful books, and we were lucky enough to get to publish Josh MacFadyen's book, Time Flies. As many of you know, the book sold out within 5 weeks, which is, I think, the first for us. The second printing is going to be shipped this week and will be in stores within the week. So if you haven't got your copy yet, there are more coming, I promise. If you're curious about the Institute or about Island Studies Press, you can look us up, either islandstudies.com or islandstudiespress.com. We're on social media. And I do have this clipboard that has a mailing list. We have a newsletter that we send out once a month that has information on islands all around the world. It's really fascinating, and we promise we will not share your information with anyone. So if you're curious about more island-related news or other upcoming lectures, you can find that on the sign-up sheet when we'll add you to the newsletter. Today, while we're all here, is to hear Dr. Joshua MacFadyen, and his topic is An Aerial History of Coastal and Ribbon Development on Prince Edward Island. And it's based on his new book, Time Flies, and he's going to be talking about development in the coastal zone and along rural roads that's been accelerating on Prince Edward Island over the last few decades, and especially when we're experiencing, coastal erosion and sustainability issues. This is a really hot topic right now, so I'm grateful that we're going to be able to hear his perspective on this. For those of you who don't know Joshua MacFadyen, this is a fun game. Is there anyone here who doesn't know Joshua MacFadyen? Awesome. This is amazing. Okay, we did this at his launch, and there was like nobody. They all knew him, so it's really lovely. Dr. Joshua MacFadyen is the Canada Research Chair in Geospatial Humanities and an Associate Professor in Applied Communication, Leadership, and Culture here at UPEI. He has 2 previous books, one called Flax Americana, a history of the fiber and oil that covered a continent, and he is a co-editor of Time and a Place, an environmental history of Prince Edward Island. So please welcome Dr. Joshua MacFadyen.
Thank you so much, Bren. You asked that question last time, and I apologize to any of you who were here last time. It's, back-to-back MacFadyen talks can be onerous, but those of you, some of you are diehards and have come out to both, but a lot of you, I know this is your first time coming out and getting to see it, so there'll be a little repetition for some. But Bren asked the same question last time, and David Cairns, right, was sitting over here. And I think I knew everybody in the room except for you, but I just introduced myself, and then you were the last one. I knew everybody in the room, which was wonderful. And now I've just met Ola and Karen. I know all about them and their decorated history on Prince Edward Island. As architects and artists, and it was lovely to meet you too. I hope by the end of the night, just to not go out of here not knowing a single one of you. So I'll try to leave time to chat at the end, if you can stick around. So many people to thank. I see my lovely wife Colleen at the back, and is our lovely daughter not here? Oh, okay, so I know you have to leave early to drive her somewhere, but and she's she's one of triplets, and I have a son who's also not here. He's here on campus, but not here. So he's now doing his first year in the music program, which is great. And of course, the one girl being a triplet, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. We just bring one representative. If I was a drummer, I would have named them Anna. Anna 1, Anna 2, Anna 3. Oh, sorry. Oh, I've got more. I see. If I can make Ed shake his head, it's going great. Ed was actually my first teacher, first professor at UPEI, and I should thank him and my some colleagues in the room. I see Irina Novacek, which is great. Someone I've worked with at Island Studies many years ago. And Jim Randall back there, just great. But Ed was my first teacher, and I didn't know this, but it was his first lecture, I think, and he was very nervous, and didn't show, of course, to me, but he's going to retire this summer. It's like just heartbreaking for those of us who are going to lose him just to the cottage, but thank you, Ed. A fun fact, in little Harry Potter trivia, the only person to be dead in Harry Potter was the history professor. This fun trivia, there's going to be a trivia question later, not on Harry Potter, but for a book prize, so I'm told. There will be a trivia question, but no, the professor was the history professor. He died and just kept on teaching and nobody noticed. So with Ed, that was never the case. He was a riveting instructor. I should have known he was a ghost, though, when he walked through the door. Oh, stop! Oh, so Time Flies is about landscape change and land use change on Prince Edward Island, more serious topics. And I've been sort of looking forward to writing this for a long time. And shout out to Alan McCachran, who's a historian at Western University and from Prince Edward Island originally, and gave in some ways the idea. I was working on aerial photos, using them for historical research. I was using maps in ways that many, of course, geographers do, but not a lot of historians had. So I was kind of doing environmental history and historical geography together, but I was unfortunately doing it in Arizona, which has some fortune and some upsides to it, definitely. But when I tried to describe what my next project was, Prince Edward Island, I had a whole bunch of people go, "Oh, that sounds lovely. What is that? Where is that?" I said, "It's in Canada." And they go, "Oh, right, the one by Vancouver." "Nope, it's on the East Coast." "Okay, so Newfoundland?" "No." Most of them didn't even know where Nova Scotia was. It was really something to see so many educated Americans not actually know Canadian geography very well. So I was thrilled to be able to come back here for the Canada Research Chair program and work in the Applied Communication Leadership and Culture program in the Faculty of Arts. And really kind of focus on this as one of my first projects. And so much help from Bailey Clark, a newly decorated student. He couldn't be here tonight, but he was really instrumental in the research, and of several other student researchers. So with all of that thanks, I did sort of, in the book launch, do a mad kind of run through the 4 chapters of the book. And I won't try to do that tonight because I want to go at not quite a breakneck pace. And I do want to focus on really that last chapter, the littoral island and wetland history of PEI, and particularly coastal development. But that part of the story couldn't be told really without parts of chapter 2, which is rural development and rural infrastructure in particular. The strip development, or residential strip development, also known as ribbon development, is a key part of that. It's a big part of Prince Edward Island's sort of historical geography, and it's a big part of its geography today. And it's also helpful for understanding the coast. So we'll kind of dive into that and show you a little bit of the, even deeper than what chapter 4 in the book can show on the sort of big screen and zooming in. I think it makes, got my laser pointer here, we can take a close look at some examples. And dive right in. But just a note on sort of the technical background of this. This came in many ways from an online survey that I had sent out to Islanders during COVID. So in some ways it was good because Islanders could do it, but the people that I really wanted to answer were farmers, and there's not that many farmers left in Prince Edward Island. We're now down to The latest census was 1900, and it's just under 2,000 for the first time ever. At one point, at its peak, it was about 14,000 farmers in PEI, so a drop to 2,000 farmers. I wanted farmers and other landowners to kind of look at this and use this really rich resource that we have, the aerial photos of PEI, which are now available. And increasingly, I've been making, this is thanks to the provincial government, very thankful for them, but also the Institute, the Island Imagined website, and the archives, especially provincial archives, working in conjunction with our own Robertson Library, Simon Lloyd, Donald Moses, and others there who were really instrumental in digitization. So you've all seen the Meacham's Atlas. Well, now you can go on to GeoPEI, which is the website that is going with this book. We have sort of two ways to get at it, and both of them are very easy to remember. upei.ca/GeoPEI, that will take you to this viewer. And then if you go /upei.ca/time flies, all one word, you'll get to sort of the home page for the book on my lab, but there's about to be in a few days a new digital companion, a web companion for the book that will sort of launch, as it were, a few new sites and tell a few new stories, a few narratives of that that didn't make it into the book for various reasons. And of course, the thing you can't do with the book, which you can do online, is interact and zoom in and change layers and really kind of explore everything from the historical maps going back to the 1880 Atlas, and even, although it's at the scale that we're interested in, the 1765 Holland map, which at this scale looks quite nice, but of course, if you're zooming into your backyard, 99% of the time it's going to be just a blurry bunch of pixels, and Holland was, of course, focused on the coast. But the kind of real crown jewel of that is the 1968 and 1935 air photos. So here's what 16,000 air photos look like, all stitched together and put into this viewer. And it's one of the kind of data sources that made the map and made the whole book possible. And sort of comparing time series, past and present, and using that to kind of look at the key episodes in the island's history in the last 85 years since air photos were first taken, and to look at some of those changes. I won't go into the primary industries today, but all that to say, it's a critical part of how rural development happens in PEI, and as Ed McDonald and others have shown, the really important role that the village plays, the small rural villages, hamlets in Prince Edward Island. There were at one point, I do, but I don't know how it pops up here. Yeah, at one point there were 400 of these small villages. And in 1971, this is a map that can show. Oh, I shouldn't wander too far this camera. This is a map that took in 1971 the census's best definition of an unincorporated settlement. And it really is kind of our iconic Prince Edward Island communities. We have many of them dotted all the way across the island. Most of those were, of course, supporting the primary sector. They were supporting the fisheries, supporting farming, and many of them were relatively self-sufficient, or if not completely autarkic, they had a lot of what they needed for everyday life. You had a blacksmith to make the metal parts for your machinery that you couldn't. That you didn't want to buy, that you had corner stores that really, for all intents and purposes, served most of the shopping needs that you had. You had, of course, a lot of home-produced food, but locally exchanged food in markets. And so these villages were really the kind of core of the island's rural development right up until this period. And the kind of interesting thing about, in 1971, the census was used to an urban nation, right? Canada passed the threshold of predominantly urban in 1921. A bunch of people have quibbled with that definition, but in that sort of interwar period, you have a mainly urban nation, and Prince Edward Island is a very predominantly rural province. And at that point, over 75% of the province lived outside of Charlottetown, Summerside, and the third largest town, well, the Three Rivers area. get into the third largest town. It's not the Three Rivers, it's Surrey. But we don't have time for that. So the census, though, has this problem because it comes to the Maritimes, and Nova Scotia would be similar. But in Prince Edward Island, it kind of threw up its hands in exasperation and said, in all other parts of Canada, we've just been putting a little asterisk next to the villages, these unincorporated communities where we really can't tell, and people seem very confused about whether they're in that area or in the one next door. And they're like, if we had put an asterisk, we would have simply every single one dotted all down the page in Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia. There were lots of uncertainties about, whether you're in North Wiltshire or Wiltshire Station, and so they tried, those are both in this map right here, in Central PEI. They tried to map them all, but they're like, it's very inaccurate, very difficult to kind of get a detailed look at this. So all the while, a little bit of primary sector land use history. This is the settlement pattern in PEI as the three counties, Prince, Queens, and Kings, all take off at roughly the same rate, although Kings is a slightly smaller and a little bit later in terms of agricultural development. Lots more forestry and some fishing, of course, in Kings County. But Kings County, at the bottom here, kind of levels off first and actually starts to decline first. And this is a period when farms have kind of really overextended themselves, and a lot of those rural villages and small town villages weren't able to support other types or many other types of economic development. So they were sending people down the road, going to the Boston States to work in the cities, going to Upper Canada, or I guess Ontario at that time. And so a lot of land was being abandoned. So right around here you start to see land abandonment. And this is where the air photos start, this is where they start to be taken. So we're seeing kind of the end of the peak of settlement, farm settlement, in the 1935 air photos, and we're really seeing over the next two time series into the 50s and 60s a rapid abandonment of land, and especially in Kings County you see like a lot of that disappear. And so at the coast this matters because the islands and coastal zone also go through a lot of change in this time. And another very important transition, talk about mechanization of agriculture and all that, but from a policy level, the 1969 Comprehensive Development Plan was a critical driver in a lot of this. It's been called the break in many ways, with it's sort of a hard break between a traditional agrarian style of economy and society and a more modern one based less on the primary sector, more on tourism and service industries. So the Comprehensive Development Plan was, of course, trying to do that. It was its stated goal was to reduce the number of farmers to a quarter and to triple the farm output. That's like right there in the black and white, right? It's what it's saying it's going to do. But in order to do that, it really had to map the entire island and work with what it thought was doing, working with farmers and rural people to kind of rationalize and make a little bit more predictable. So it was a very heavy-handed central plan. It was actually, in the Soviet style, it was three 5-year plans. It was a 15-year plan that was going to be done in 3 5-year blocks. And so the map makers here, I love them, my madmen, and this is Ed McDonald gave me his copy of the extra copy of the plan. This is graphics right out of the text. They're there planning and poring over, and this is a period called by many as like the high modernist period of Canadian development. So the planners go out to the communities and they bring these maps with them and they just kind of set them up, and there's this great, showed up at the National Film Board, records Charlie Raymond, one of the people who had been working for many years in PEI, looking at its land use and saying, yeah, just put this up, put it on the board, show people, look at how inefficient your land use is. And all these kind of like a spaghetti diagram is people living in one parcel and then farming 3 or 4 parcels down the road. Very common. And still is, but you're passing the other farmer as you go down the road. You should actually sell your land to them, and they might have a little parcel closer to yours that they can sell to you. And they launched the Land Development Committee Corporation to try and expedite this, but it was a very heavy central plan, and it was not popular. It there was a lot of pushback from the beginning, and by 1972, 1973, we've got people in the room who were here at the time, and kind of going through some of these things in the island's history. But it was very unpopular, and a lot at what was the Rural Development Committee?
No, it would be council.
Rural Development Council held many meetings across the island, and it was very clear, writing as well, there was not popular support for this. And it was around that time, actually 50 years ago, this last fall, that Andy Wells picked up a copy of Ernst Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, and had a good read of that. Passed it along to, oh my goodness, I see other people who know all these people in the room. Passed it along to Premier, Premier Campbell at the time, and the youngest and longest serving Premier of PEI, and said, you know what, this is what we're doing here might be a fit somewhere else, but it's not a good fit for PEI. It's not, it might fit in Upper Canada, but it's not a good fit here. And Ernst Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful Economics as If People Mattered, argued for a human scale in economic development, a human scale in technology, and not just kind of like mechanizing and expanding at all costs. So one of the land consolidation processes here is, as they encourage land consolidation, the province actually experimented with something called hedgerow removal. And hedgerow removal is something I had heard about for my whole life growing up, and everyone said that it was fairly common. So enter the kind of 21st century social scientist myself, raised on a farm in PEI. My parents, Donald and Carolyn MacFadyen, are there. Thank you very much. Raised on an island farm, and been kind of like taught and learned about these kind of parts of our history. So Comprehensive Development Plan was, part of its effort was to encourage hedgerow removal and field expansion. And the replacement of these small postage size, kind of a quilt of small fields that were designed to resist economic shock. When one type of agriculture failed, another type would be there to pick it up. They were also designed so that you could circulate animals throughout your farm. They were designed that you could, it was very, very much grass-based. There were not very many potatoes in PEI at that point. And crops, like grains, to the extent that they were grown, were often grown for feeding the local livestock. So one of the things that, though, didn't quite make sense to me is, why would farmers do that? I mean, I know they were encouraged to do it. There were a few attempts to do it. And we have seen quite a bit of hedgerow sort of and farm reorientation. But despite having kind of ads like this one, you know, where you could take your Pickard machinery, which would have been, I think, either sold right in the corner over there at that point. I'm not sure if they were already up in Belvedere. But selling bulldozers to, you know, you couldn't afford not to buy a bulldozer and go out. You could get extra land without, you could get $50 an acre. You could go out, fill in the gullies, pull down the hedgerows, fill in the wetlands, and make yourself brand new farmland without ever buying another piece. So the Caterpillar companies, and they're all doing this. But if you look at these machines, they're tiny little machines. And one of my favorite stories from the CDB plan was that the provincial government got itself up by Foxley River. They were doing an experiment in clearing, trying to clear large amounts of farmland to help farmers grow and expand and get their farms bigger. But the machinery kept breaking down, and they eventually wrote it off, and actually took quite a long time to pay pickers, and they were quite cross about that. But so one thing I wanted to do in the lab here, Enter the 21st Century, is use the air photos for not just kind of interesting storytelling and anecdotes from across the island, but to use it in kind of an analytical way. And without going into too much detail, here were 14 lots or townships in PEI that we used as examples or as case studies to see, okay, so looking at the air photos in 1968, which is the very beginning of the plan, and looking at them in 2000, 2010, and the latest ones now, 2020, do we see hedgerows being pulled up and removed, or do we see them remaining fairly stable, or even increasing? And here, oh, that's not the, wrong slide, those are livestock, also very, very important, big part of the story. Oh no, I've missed the slide. You're going to have to trust me. All 60 of those lots look a lot like this, which is why I thought I was pointing at the right one. All of them went up, and the total increase was about 43% in all of these lots. So they're all kind of creeping upward in terms of total hedgerow area. And when you divide it by the amount of land that's in farmland, it's actually going up even more. So there's an actual increase in the amount of hedgerows. But we do know that field consolidation was occurring. So what was going on? Well, what was happening was that farms were allowing the hedgerows around their farms to grow up, and they were tearing out the hedgerows in between. And those were usually smaller, patchier kind of hedgerows that were used for kind of, at one point, fencing in livestock. And so when those came out, the actual hedgerows on the sides of farms began to grow even more. And they were, I call them ancient kind of farm structures. They were part of your farm infrastructure just the way a barn or a house or a lane or a culvert was. You had that hedgerow there for a long time. It was actually, not only was it difficult to remove, but it didn't make sense to remove it. So found in that part of the story that it had actually increased, but just in ways that were a little bit interesting and surprising. All right, let's move along to the actual, some of the sites that I look at and kind of look at the coast. So let's go way up west, I think, for one. This is Fee Shore in West Prince, and there's if you look at this, this is in 2020. This is Lot 1 at the very northwest tip. It's kind of hard to see it here, but that is an index map of PEI, and there's a star over the top. Fee Shore was one of the Irish settlements in Lot 1, and of course Fee, and you see a lot of names on here that are Irish, a lot of Fees, which are related to McPhee and Martins. The Fees were both doing small-scale farming, and they were doing lobster fishing and canning as well. And at that time, your canneries were spread along the shore, and your facilities were there. And even in 1935, which you can start to see them here, if you really squint, you can kind of see the whole structure here. This is where the big blue whale was buried as well in the 80s, but this was at one point all buildings set up for the fisheries at the end of Fee Shore Road. And if you just watch here at one of these kind of close-up views, you'll see not only dramatic kind of erosion occur, those A, D, and C don't move, it's the shoreline that does. So D, I think I took D off, but put it back on here. So this is 1968. You can see how D is now, that's it in 1935, 1968. The coast is just kind of stripping away in many parts of the island. And Fee Shore is one example. But another aspect of this is that farmers, in this case, many parts of the island, farmers do not sort of disturb the shore quite as much as they do here. But this is one example where you can see farming intensively happening right on the edge. And that's a large gully that forms from kind of overgrazing near the edge. You see a lot of the small fields even still in 1968. And interestingly, you can kind of, I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, but those zigzag lines are snake fences. That's fencing done without posts. This is a very, I guess primitive is a word, but it's a 19th century way of making fencing, and it was very popular in West Prince. And so much so that even in the 60s, 70s, even I found a spot in 1990 where you could see the snake fencing from the air. Mr. Knox wrote a great article about the role of fencing. It's very critical because fencing requires a lot of wood, and as fences rot over the years, they have to be replaced. And one of the places that farmers went to get more fencing was into the hedgerows. So they were both using the hedgerows as fences, but because of so much livestock on PEI at this period, they were actually needing the hedgerows, but also cutting into them quite a bit. So that was it in 1958, 1968, 2000, and you can see the kind of different, that's the original spot where A was in 1935. And most of that land is gone. So there are many cases like this in the book where it shows examples of coastal erosion, examples of intense activity on the coast that really did impact and it made erosion worse. And so I won't get into it, but one of those spots, if you really squint at it, you can see that it's caused kind of wind blow erosion. Of course, it's one of the windiest spots on the island, which is why in the last photo there you can see one of the windmills with its with the shadow of its blades just stretching out over the edge. And just a little farther up, Elephant Rock has formed, raised its trunk, and passed away in the meantime. For those from away here, Elephant Rock was an iconic coastal formation that looked like a nice big elephant for about 2 decades, I believe, and then it washed away. So, Fee Shore, an example of kind of mixed farming and pretty intense coastal activity. But then let's go down to a familiar place. Moving a little farther east on the coastline, we have Lennox Island, and in 2020, it's, of course, like all of PEI, Mi'kma'ki, it's the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and here it's looking quite developed, but in 1880, there it is with at the exact same location. So in some places I do use the atlases. You can see the Labob and the Bernards and the snakes and sarks all kind of up around this area. But you can even show how kind of land use changes and kind of where the roads are being put in. At this point, of course, there's no causeway, so Lennox Island is accessed mostly on the Chapel Point here. When the causeway goes in, 1935, it's still not there, and 1968 it is, but I zoom in now on the causeway and look at 68. East Biddeford is preparing, and by 74 the causeway is in. I think it went in 73, just before this, or 72. But you can see also a lot of road realignment that happens with this, with development. And it kind of, anytime you drive down a PEI road, you can pretty well ask yourself, why is this here, and what was it like before? And it's almost always different. There's a lot of roads, and there's a lot of history behind how island roads get realigned, and this book kind of dives into some of it and shows it from the air. So there's the causeway being put in, and some aquaculture, of course, being developed, Hardy Channel, these are the Hardy brothers. I could be wrong, it's in the book. But so aquaculture going in, of course a lot of coastal recreation as well. You really see that in this one, even back in 1974, some boats doing figure eights. I don't think that's your typical aquaculture launch pattern. That's looks a little bit more like fun recreation to me. So moving along our coast here, Cape Egmont in the Acadian Peninsula is another one that I like. And in this place, you really have, I think at this scale, yes, you can see right from what's now the bottle houses would be right about here. So they appear after the 60s, of course. Yeah, there's the bottle houses there in Part E. But again, when you see kind of the big retreat that the coast has made in certain points, this is the Centre Goland, the resort center there. But just watch kind of the distance from shore that sort of washed out area goes between 1968 and 2020, in just over 50 years. Same out here, where the lighthouse has to be moved about every 15 or 20 years, it seems, on Egmont Point. And it's and every year the lighthouse is in a slightly different spot, and it can kind of show that it's actually been moved. The same thing happens with a lot of the coastal housing. So this house here, this is 2020, but if you go even to the year before that, it's been moved from where it was very close to the shore. So people there obviously know that the coast is eroding. And the other one is the Mount Carmel Chapel, right? That's, I don't know, it's not right on the edge, but it's a very important heritage building it's pretty close to a quickly eroding area. I like this series though because it also shows the change both on the coast but also in agriculture and land use. So going back to 68, you can see the really intensive forest harvesting going on here for presumably for firewood and fencing. But these big patches all throughout the forest are more or less gone by 2020. But there's quite a few places in the book where you see that intensive forest activity has declined, although in some other areas it picks up. The big change, though, that you really see wherever you've got land as opposed to just sea and coastal is this kind of reversion. So large amounts of forest grow up. You can see how it's mostly cleared farmland here in the 1930s. And then by 1968, it's being abandoned, it's growing up, and there it is. So this is, in some ways, the comprehensive development plan was encouraging this. It was saying, you know, farmers should leave behind land that's not highly productive. They should get out of farming, retrain, have better lives for them and their children in urban areas and cities. But islanders were really reluctant to do that, and they didn't want to be told to do that. So as much as it has happened in many ways, you know, so I'm maybe the first MacFadyen in 500 years to not actually be farming, but you know, I grew up on a farm, but I'm not farming, and you know, there's a reason for that. There's 1,900 farms on PEI, and there's a reason that they're very much an aging demographic. There are reasons why people aren't going into it. But to keep this at the coast, as I promised, let's look at a few more. So, of course, one of the famous, it's on the cover of the book, Robinson's Island, is the story of the national park acquiring the land that was at that time an actual island on the North Shore, Little Harbor on the east, Big Harbor on the west, was going to be turned into an island, and from increasingly what we can tell is that it was the intention was to connect the PEI National Park on both ends, east and west. Of course, you have Brackley just east of here, and North Rustico and Cavendish just to the west. But here's a case where, of course, expropriation and forced central planning did evict farms, and this was the two Robinson farms there, C and D, were on this land. Here's a picture of the Robinson girls at the Robinson girls at the well, visiting after it had already been abandoned, but kind of going back just to see before it essentially gets demolished. So the land use, of course, is brought back to nature. This was the plan of many of the national parks, was to return and to protect. You know, if it was the U.S.'s best idea, it was many historians have argued that it was Canada's first. And the national park system was to preserve this land for future generations and for natural conservation. This tension, though, between what is human nature and what is non-human nature has always been there. So in 1968, the land is heavily reverting, and there's already campgrounds being built into it. But I think more importantly, you can see after the dike has been put in, and I've got a close-up of that in a second, it causes increased channel currents to run to the west end through Rustico Harbor. And as that increased channel flow occurs, there's people, Barbara here knows all about this, and St. Peter's is another great example of this. The coast is never secure. It is always moving. And it's not a good idea to try and build a road out off the end of it and then bridge between two parts and bring kind of all of Canada, 1 million tourists a year, here and ask them to drive over that trepidatious, that precarious ledge. In the close-up, you can actually see all those little sort of dots and fingers in the beaches are berms and bulwarks that have been built to try to hold the sand. It was a classic dune morphology technique to try and lock and preserve sand in place. And you can see actually in the east it worked really well. So there, of course, the story is that it didn't work, of course, at all, and that's Robinson's Island today in 2020. It blew out, and there was no hope at all of connecting the east and west with the road. They also abandoned the campground, and since Hurricane Fiona have abandoned Robinson's Island itself to vehicle traffic. The bridge will no longer be maintained along here, even though in the photo you see quite a few beachgoers there with their cars just back in 2020. So they're already 2020 is history. Incredible. So this is a close-up of that area. This is the eastern edge where Little Harbor was dammed. You get a better view there of the Robinson farms, the stacks of hay in the fields, they're actively farming. Actually weren't living there at this point, but they were clearly going over to keep cropping it. That's part of the story of what happens to PEI's offshore islands. It's in some ways they were expropriated, and it was very disruptive to obviously the families along that area. But as part of the longer history of coastal and offshore islands, people didn't want to stay there much longer in the 20th century for a number of reasons, which I'll explain. So the harbor gets built, and this is a 1956 image that we had to order directly from the Air Photo Library, because this is like as construction is happening. You can see the vehicles kind of at work. It's called a dike, not a bridge. So a dike is being built, and if you pay attention down here, This is the dike that kind of goes up into the sand, and this becomes the sand berms. It's not actually the road. If you watch, the road kind of comes down here onto the beach. So the road is built down here, and what you see here are these huge dunes that today, as you walk by, you might think they're natural, but they're completely artificial. Underneath them, somewhere down deep below them, is a network of sand berms that you can see being built here in 1956. So in 2020, there it is with our beachgoers. So why did people leave, and why might the Robinsons have eventually left the island? Well, it has to do with those villages. The villages were great ways to supply almost everything that you needed in rural Prince Edward Island. However, the villages on the islands lacked one very important thing, and that, of course, is a road. A road that goes over land. The island's first roads were its rivers, and islands suited people very well that way. But when the rise of the automobile and the importance and increasing expansion of paved roads occurs, you get people wanting to leave. And so I'll dwell for a minute on Botten Island, then I'll talk about ribbon development, and I'll end this and take some questions. But Botten Island, here it is in 2020, is a really interesting example of both environmental change, driven in some ways by humans, in other ways by nature, and this longer process of farm abandonment. So here's Botten Island in 1935, a crisscross network of 16 farms and a bunch of lobster canneries. So when those lobster canneries were going full tilt, I understand there were hundreds of workers living on the island for maybe a couple of weeks. And they were especially active around on this coast here. So Botten Island is a bustling hive of activity. Ed McDonald's father had great recollections of fishing along these shores and seeing, I think the story I picked up on was the hay being exported off the island. And that was one thing that's really important to me, because I'm interested in energy and how farms can maintain kind of the energy flows that they need for their own families and for their own livestock. And what we feed animals is something that's been kind of, it's very little studied in history, maybe surprisingly. Animal feed, really? But I find it super important because as we see livestock systems changing on PEI, becoming more concentrated and eventually declining, we see the breakdown of these kinds of systems. So not only was this a relatively sustainable farm system, but it was actually exporting hay. And the reason they were able to export so much hay off Botten Island was because of those lobsters. They were producing thousands and maybe millions of lobsters, and the canning process meant you took the meat out and sent it off, right? You didn't send it to a restaurant in the shell. Thousands of millions of shells get spread all over Botten Island every year after year, and it creates this really rich soil nutrient balance. And Botten Island is an example of a kind of really resilient and robust hay exporting island. So why would anybody leave this bucolic place, huh? You can see the fishing fleet there under B. Keep in mind that on the first image, and you'll probably know from today if you've hiked it this way, Botten Island is connected back by sand. And it was connected by sand as early in the earliest records I could find from 1812. 1812, some records of the, based on the historical questionnaires that were done in 1876. Farmers remember driving animals onto Botten Island over the sand, and they were using Botten Island at that point as a sort of contained pasture, sending animals over in an almost kind of like an itinerant, what's the word, driving pasture and staying there with them. Come to me. It's very popular in Europe. There's UNESCO sites dedicated to it. But so like living and driving animals off onto an island. But then, of course, population, those 16 families come by, and then they start to develop. But at one point, the fishing community lobbied to have the spit removed. And so the province actually dredged a small opening through the spit, which then caused actually, of course, intense erosion, and the whole thing disappears. And here we have, by 1935, almost no spit at all. Botten Island is very much an island, and of course it's got a second island. And farmers at that point, though, there was always this tension between farming and fishing. And in order to reestablish both connections, there's examples of it here. to this small island and back to the mainland of brushing or bushing, putting dead pine trees and other evergreens, just kind of sticking them in the sand and kind of building up a very rudimentary form of what you saw going on with parks in Robinson's Island. So farmers at one point did that, so much so that you could see the spit begin to develop by 1968, and it actually is completely reconnected by 2020. Whether it will remain is a question I can't tell you. But also quite importantly here is that as these farms are abandoned, they're growing up, and there is a major drive in the 70s, as many of you know, to develop the offshore islands and create, went unintentionally ahead, and to create cottage developments there with ferry terminals. Tourism is beginning to boom, and islanders know that there's a niche here. It's a possibility of getting more tourists into place, and seasonal homes into places like the islands. However, thanks to a 1977 report, I don't know if Diane Griffin was the lead author of it, but she was definitely involved in it. 1977 report argues that the islands, offshore islands, PEI's offshore islands, are essentially our wildland. It is what we have instead of crown land. The offshore islands should be protected, and many of them were, including the resistance against the tourism, the cottage development in Bottom Island and in Cascapac and Olden Island. So that means that the island looks like this, and under point C there's a heron nesting ground, which was a unique location. That was one of the reasons for that drive. So I promised to end with the kind of a closer look at the story of ribbon development, and of course the islands and the coasts are a form of ribbons. But when you look at, sort of go back to PEI and mark just its houses today, you can see some pretty obvious patterns. There's nothing on this map, no labels, no roads, except for one point for every single home on PEI in 2020. And clearly you can see the roads, but you can also see patterns, concentrations. And I don't have time to go into it, but you really, over the 20th century, see the gravitational pull of Charlottetown. And the book talks a bit more about that in chapter 2, how different quadrants around Charlottetown kind of vie, or maybe unintentionally vie, for predominance as the place where most of the suburban growth would occur. However, one thing that, despite 50 years of demands going back to the 1973 Royal Commission on the Land and the Lands Act on PEI, the 50 years have gone, and we've had 6 or 7, if you can count sub-reports, reports that have called for a plan that would make this a little bit more intentional. And that is where I'll end it with, because in 2020, we can then take these and say, well, let's look at, instead of the homes, let's look at just properties. And what this is a map of is every single parcel on PEI that's 5 acres or less along its roads. And if you remove the coastline because of cottage development and the urban areas, so you see Charlottetown, including its suburbs. I did that for consistency with chapter 2, throughout chapter 2. But removing those, we can really see where ribbon development is kind of densest. And you can kind of even just see it from looking at the sort of blue, the sort of depth of the blue. But one thing I did for you guys just today was took that one step farther and said, well, what if we took that and just used a bit of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to map where it's most intense. And I'll zoom into a place like O'Leary here in a second and show you that instead of the kind of blues, which are just the location of parcels, we can convert those to an actual map of where ribbon development is most intense. And so this is ribbon development. This is O'Leary as an example of it. It's where farms along any kind of arterial or fast-moving road get turned into small residential parcels, and that's usually through the process of families subdividing and either selling off or bequeathing to their children the land that was on them. So ribbon development's it's possible to see it in this like just clusters of blue, but one thing the book does in a little more detail is it dives into that and says what might be behind that historically. Why some places, why there, and why not there, right? Why? Well, O'Leary's a draw. Now in this case I've left out O'Leary because it's very urban, or it's relatively urban for West Prince, and so I removed all of the census dedicated urban areas just to focus on rural versions of strip development. So one example, one reason why, and this really shows up more in the Surrey example in the book, West Surrey, because you have areas like this where there's one large parcel. It becomes easier to split that large parcel into many subdivisions. It happens here as well on some of these perpendicular ones, but what I find with the analysis is that it happens more and more aggressively in areas where farms were unbroken tracks or were actually parallel to the roadway, which is of course the case in many island roads. But if we take that and look now at the land use, this is 1935. A lot of farms, but this is also getting built up even in 1935. And by 1968, that is already in place. The ribbon development is already in place. Just next to O'Leary, this is Unionvale. So Unionvale itself is a bit of a support. It's people who, I guess, don't want to live in O'Leary, they want to live just outside it, but it's also supporting agriculture. But what's left us with today is that with our very small number of farms, we have a very large number of rural residents living along the roads in what's this very popular process of urban development. So to zoom out then and look at the island as I promised as a whole, this is our island with its 5 acre or less properties. And just to show you how this works, every segment on PEI, every road segment I mean, can then be kind of converted to a number that represents the number of small parcels next to it. Now unfortunately this kind of shows us where the issue is, right? It kind of shows us the issue, but unfortunately you can have a very small segment that has 25, that have a very small segment that doesn't per kilometer of road actually indicate very much. So I instead flipped this around to a slightly different map, which visualizes the segments with the number of small parcels per kilometer of road, if you follow me. So looking again, I'm just going to show that we're going to take out most of these urban areas because and coastal areas because I wanted to focus on just the rural ribbon development. And this is what it looks like here. These are areas where there's about 2 to 5 houses per kilometer, 5 to 7 houses, 7 to 10, and really the red areas where you have over 10. And the patterns, I think, become pretty clear, although in ways that I maybe didn't really expect even when I published the book. This is new stuff you guys are seeing. So there's the Knutsford, O'Leary strip, and it's really predominant along there. So I'll leave this to the historians and to those of us to debate in the room. Why is ribbon development so predominant on the Unionvale Road? Early answers after just kind of like crunching these numbers earlier today might be that there are actually fishers who are working in Miminigash, working down at West Point, and living just along the roads not too far away toward O'Leary where there's services. So I don't know that for sure. I don't have their occupational statuses, but the other clear trend is that around the Charlottetown area, there's very little in the way of planning and protection to get our ribbon development under control and to get municipalities on PEI the power to zone their own land and to plan for a future where, whether it's climate shocks on the coast, like some of the things we've seen, or whether it's just development gone a little bit out of control, how are our municipalities going to respond if we go one more decade without an actual provincial plan? So it's been another call for it in the 2020 or 2019 Land Matters report, but it's going to take, I think, some courageous political leadership and voices from PEI's public to say, what are we going to do about this and make sure that this doesn't continue across the entire island, whether it's coastal or inland. So with that, I will land the plane, as it were, and stop and ask for any questions. Thank you very much.
Why would ribbon development be undesirable?
Well, I didn't actually say it was undesirable, though most of those reports did. I tend to think that great to hear from the audience on this one. It's ultra low density, first of all. So we have a density problem in PEI, and despite for many years being the most densely populated province in Canada, which I always thought is hilarious, like kind of a factoid to throw out there, it just means that we don't have large tracts of crown land. And if we included some of the southern Gulf or our offshore island environments, maybe we're actually not densely populated. And indeed, we're actually very low. We've been a low density, very rural province for quite a long time. But from tip to tip, there are communities. Those 400 communities are all across the island, and you know, there's a lot of history there. People want to live in rural areas for family reasons, cultural reasons, and I think that should be allowed and encouraged. But there's got to be a way to make services that you need to deliver to those communities sustainable. So with ultra low density, everybody's going to want high-speed internet. They're going to want snow removal every 3 hours or less going out their front door. They're going to want every service that everybody gets in the city, but they're going to want it out in an area where there's 3 houses on a huge long street. So to me, that's just unsustainable. That's not smart. It's beautiful. I love the rural views in PEI. Would love the idea of living on it myself, but despite having grown up in the country, I'm leaning toward urban environments as the more sustainable of the two. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts or questions.
Yeah, I always thought that one of the reasons for people maybe moving out of the urban areas was, and maybe it's an urban myth, but lower property taxes. And that people found it less expensive to live 10 kilometers outside of Charlottetown than inside Charlottetown.
Yeah, but with that, you're spending, of course, a lot on fuel.
Well, fuel didn't used to be an issue.
Yeah, it's, you know, yeah, as a proportion of your total income, I suppose it wasn't, but it's definitely an issue now. And taxation, yeah, is an issue. And I'm not going to actually prognosticate or say too much about what I think should happen, but I can talk a bit more about what has happened. And those were just very popular places, and I think lower taxes is a big part of it. Yeah, it's whether it's marginal or actually a driver, I don't know, but someone else knows. Jim and then Dave.
Many years ago, I tried to get one of my PhD students to write his dissertation on home-based businesses along arterial rural areas, not PEI, but in Saskatchewan. Yeah. I wasn't able to convince him to do that, but I always found it a fascinating process because I've looked at home-based businesses, how people survive and thrive, their economy within those, and it has, in some cases, has to do with the amount of traffic that goes along those arterials, because it's not necessarily just that they're primary employees, or often there's people trying to make do with a variety of different kinds of businesses in those areas, within those households. So obviously it's not your subject, but I've always found it fascinating, the household economies along those arterials.
And yeah, that's really interesting. Of course, the internet and COVID and remote working seems poised to change a lot of that, or enhance home-based economic activity in those arterial roads and rural areas. Yeah, it doesn't address the issue of kind of services for per person and per tax dollar, but it is really interesting. Yeah, Jim, that's a good point.
I'll first make a comment. Some of the patterns of urban development on Prince Edward Island might have to do with the differential treatment of, according to the classification of road systems on PEI, that requires a greater spacing in more heavily traveled roads. My family owns some properties. Been in the family for about 90 years. We're looking at subdividing that property for a building lot for my son. It's on Route 225. Route 225 is classified as a collector road. I didn't even know such thing existed. on PEI.
Yeah,
And you can't build a house for a lot more than, I think it's 1,300 feet or something like that. Whereas less traveled roads have less restrictions.
yeah, I pointed out it's difficult to see Route 2 here, but Route 2 is actually on the blue map, a little bit less, a less dense ribbon development, and I think that is for exactly that reason, that you have to have larger distances, visibility, and you can't put lanes in. Putting driveways in is much more difficult on it. So I actually didn't look too closely, and yeah, indeed that's Route 2. Route 2 right there. It's very kind of lightly colored in most places. You just can't move onto Route 2 and put in driveways every 10 feet. It'd be suicide.
But I'd like to ask a broader question on PEI. You drive around, and wherever you go, there are houses. Unless it's a swamp, poorly drained, or a few spots in Kings County, heavily forested. People live everywhere. If you drive through rural Alberta, people are confined to villages and to low densities in rural areas. If you drive through Iceland, most of the area outside towns and cities is completely devoid of anybody at all, it seems. Very, very low density. How did we get to where we are compared with other places in the world? Is it always a matter of regulation and zonation, or is it a matter of cultural patterns and individual choices?
It's a good question. Looking back to the 400 villages, that is definitely a draw, and it is a slight, I'm reluctant to use the word unique in many of these places and situations, but it's a slightly more unique Prince Edward Island or maritime phenomenon of these robust villages, so recent in our past. In many other places, that transition, sometimes called the Great Transition or the social ecological transformation of agrarian to urban societies, happen more quickly, and they happen with the support of other parts of the economy, such as manufacturing. If you think of southwestern Ontario, there's always a mill. There's always a mill town or a factory town, not too far away, for kind of youth and these families to send their young people to. That just didn't exist in PEI. Could argue that fox farming was a version of it, or fishing was a version of it. Canneries were a version of it, but it was always primary sector based. The zoning, though, is got to be part of it, and here's where I will kind of not say much more, because I know that some of the farm groups today are calling for farmland, which is in steep decline. Another topic we didn't get into, but 20% loss of farmland in the last 20 years is partly because of some of that development, but also reversion and the building of infrastructure for tourism in the last 20-30 years, but without kind of anything to zone agricultural land as. So they're calling for the ability to zone farmland as resource that can't be immediately changed. So in Ontario, you haven't been able to cut, now this is on a county level, it's not a provincial law, in virtually all of, from Peterborough to Windsor, you haven't been able to cut your farm woodlot without permissions. You cannot clear farm land. You cannot clear woodland in most counties in southern Ontario. So there are clearly restrictions that are going back to the 1930s. People agreed in the 1930s and 40s to do this. In PEI, we've never had even a conversation that I know about.
I think most of Europe is like that.
Yeah, exactly, with tougher regulations. Yeah, if you want to clear land in southwest Ontario, you've got to go through your county and go through quite a bit of bureaucracy. I see a hand here.
Thanks, Josh, for the talk, as always. I just wanted to take a bit of a run at the question David asked.
Please.
And I'm going to throw a few things out there. The reason that there are people everywhere in PEI is in part because almost all of it is arable land.
Yep.
And that is unusual in Canada. And because of the Holland map and because of the division of the townships and the granting of lands to the landlords who had as their plan to divide their townships up into small farms of 100 acres and rent them out. Early on, we get into a bit of a template where people are settling on farms. So where do you get a village? You get a village where there's a crossroads, where there's a bridge, where there's a shipping point, and eventually where there's a railway station. So that leads to kind of a clustering of people into small nodes. But the nature of the landscape makes it easy to settle across the whole landscape, rather than in pockets with a division caused by geography. And that is unusual on a province-wide basis. And that's the other aspect, is that we are a jurisdiction and have been one since 1769 with a government of our own, which allowed for things to develop in certain ways. That if you're in Ontario, there's southern Ontario, but there's also all different areas of Ontario. So I think partly it's the question of history and geography.
Thank you, Ed. It's good to have an expert in the room. Callum?
Connected to that is pretty well, I mean, your economy is on the farm, right? And then that moves towards the city through the centuries. But we're like a very early settlement in Canada. We're earlier than Ontario, other than maybe Newfoundland and bits of Nova Scotia. And so we started out very rural and gradually become cities.
And our cities grow so much slower too, that they actually have a lot of space in them. There's not, our urban, as I understand it, the urban space constraints, much as we all feel it in Charlottetown, is nothing compared to other cities built on peninsulas. Because it's a more recent urban boom. Do we have a skill testing question? Okay, what is it? My mother's going to bring the question. If anyone gets it, they get the book. Is this a deal, Brent?
Yeah, so this is like one of the last copies of the first edition that I just snagged from my office.
Woo!
So we have a skill
That's
testing
tough.
question. You can't find this anywhere in town right now.
Josh mentioned that Mountain Island was known for 2 major exports. Can you name them?
Hay and lobsters.
Hay and lobster.
Hay and lobster. She raised her hand, so I think I'll give it up for my mother, Carolyn MacFadyen. And for Carol. I guess that concludes our...
Yeah, so if there aren't any more questions, I just wanted to thank you all for coming and let you know that the next lecture series is on February 27th, and it's actually also a book launch for The Bridge Effect. And this is a book that looks at what happens to islands when they get bridged, whether that's a physical bridge or when they get high-speed internet. And there's a chapter in here about Prince Edward Island and our bridge and how people feel about it 26 years later. And there's essays from bridges and islands all around the world. So February 27th, hope to see you there. And thank you all for coming. Safe travels home and stay warm.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.